Hi everybody! Happy April 1st! Did anybody play an April Fool's joke on you? Or did you play one on anybody else? If you did, tell me about it in the comments. I'd like to hear. Well, nobody played an April Fool's joke on me today, but that's fine. So we're going to be reading in our story The Ghost Dog of Stony Ridge, and we're already on Chapter 8, Mystery of Sudden Lake. Now, if you remember, Grandpa Dylan, he's going to take DJ and Alfred down to the lake, and we'll find out what he finds out. What they find out. Mrs. Stagg opened the door and welcomed her unexpected visitors to come inside. She seated them and called to her husband and daughter. In a moment, the big preacher entered from the kitchen. Paul Stagg had to duck his head slightly to miss the top of the doorway. He engulfed each of his visitors' hands. That means his hand was so big it just kind of swallowed them up. And turned and spoke warmly. Mrs. Stagg said she'd make some coffee for Grandpa and open some soft drinks for the boys. She left the room. Kathy did not appear, and DJ felt uneasy and anxious. "Well now," the giant preacher boomed, sitting down in his favorite chair and crossing his polished brown cowboy boots. "What brings you three to this side of town?" Grandpa seemed a little embarrassed. DJ decided. He wanted the old man to have a moment to work out a way to discuss his problem. The boy said, "Grandpa took us for a little drive, and Alfred and I had some questions about a hound, so we dropped by." "Glad you did, glad you did. Now, if you boys are thinking you're going to catch that there ghost dog, you just better forget it." Alfred's disappointment showed on his face. "Why? Did somebody catch him already?" "No," the giant laughed, the sound bubbling up from his huge chest with a pleasant bass tone. "But just about every man in town whoever followed a hound is dying to own that bugle mouth. Why, even Boot Malone has offered a bonus for bringing in that hound." Grandpa cackled like a Rhode Island red hen and slapped his knee. "That's a good un. That old horse thief never offered anybody a bonus in his whole ornery life. Whoops! Brother Paul, I done it again. I'm a judging my fellow man just like afore I became a Christian." "I'm sure the good Lord understands, Mr. Dillon. He's mighty apt to forgive us, especially when our heart's right. But our old habits still want to hang on like leeches." All of you know what a leech is? It's kind of a worm-looking creature that lives in the water. And if you go through muddy areas, sometimes there'll be leeches in there and they'll stick on you. And what they do is they want to suck out part of your blood. In fact, they use them for medical things. If people have too much swelling and they have dead blood, maybe because of a wound, and they need to get that cleaned out, they'll even put leeches on for that. I don't know if I would like that, but that's what he's mean. They hang on like leeches. You can't just rub them off. You gotta pull them off. Alfred sighed with relief. "Then nobody's caught the hound, so we still got a chance." "Reckon so, Alfred. Just remember the woods is full of hunters trying to catch that dog. They figure it's a wild one that drifted into the area and belongs to the man who can catch him." "Brother Paul," DJ asked, "do you have any suggestions on how Alfred and I could catch that ghost bugler before anybody else does?" "Well, I hadn't rightly thought about it, boys, but don't you already have a hound, Alfred? You mean Duger? He's my little brother's dog. No, I mean I heard you got a stray, a black and tan, I believe, that sort of adopted you. Blackie's just a skinny hound that somebody dumped. His feet are all cut up. They never seem to heal, though we put ointment on them and he just lies around all day. When we do take him out, he's no good on the trail. DJ added, when we took that stray out with Duger and Hero, we let Blackie go first to see if he was a pappy dog, but he didn't bay at the trail. When we cut in another dog, Blackie quit the scent and came back. Well now, boys, the preacher said thoughtfully, shaking his head, I've known of hounds that were loners. I had one myself, Old Blue. Worked great by his lonesome. Wouldn't work with a pack of hounds. He was a cold nose and ran by himself. Wouldn't even bay until he was looking at him, looking at whatever he was chasing. You know, don't spook the game that way either. But when a younger hound caught up with him, this old cold nose of mine would plumb quit the trail and come in. I couldn't drive him back on that trail, no way. But he was a great dog if you left him alone until he was baying hot on the trail. Then we could send him some other dogs and help bay the game. You see, some hounds are like men. They just like to work alone and in their own way. The talk drifted to the latest news on the radio. Brother Paul said them environmental people have been taking samples and things out at Sudden Lake. They pretty well decided the mill's causing the problem. Of course, the big bosses at the mill say they're not causing it. Don't know who's right, them environmental people or the mill people. But one of the men who works there told me there's talk that the environmental people may close the mill down if the polluting doesn't stop. Losing an awful lot of jobs if that happens, including your boys' daddies. DJ asked, do you know what the chemical is that's killing the fish? I heard, but I don't remember. But my daughter does. The big man turned and called, Kathy, come here, please. She came slowly, DJ saw. She didn't look at DJ, but let her blue eyes rest briefly on Grandpa and Alfred before settling on her father's eyes. He asked about the name of the chemical the toxologist had identified in the lake. Kathy said it's supposed to be a chemical called pentachlorophenol. Boy, that's a hard word to say. But most people shorten it to penta. DJ frowned, remembering what the newspaper editor told him. What does it look like? She turned her very blue eyes on him, but there was no warmth in them. I have some information on that chemical, Kathy said. Cut it from today's newspaper. I haven't seen it yet, DJ said. Would you like to see it? She asked, letting her reddish gold hair cascade down both sides of her face and rest on her shoulders. DJ nodded, not trusting himself to speak. She left the room. The boy looked after her, thinking it was Ormley Crater's fault that Kathy was being so distant. As DJ remembered the ham and eggs incident Kathy had witnessed, the angry feeling came back. It got worse when he thought of the bicycle episode and Kathy's unfair reaction to what he had told her. Brother Paul said fondly, she's really interested in nature and the environment and that sort of thing. I'm going to be a naturalist, Alfred volunteered. Let me read what a naturalist is. Naturalist. Someone who studies nature. such as a botanist who studies plant life or a zoologist who studies animal life. Okay? Alfred volunteered, looking around through his thick glasses. And DJ's going to be a writer, you know. Right now, he's trying to get information to write a story for a national magazine and win a prize. Before anyone could reply to Alfred's comment, Kathy returned with the clipping. She handed it to DJ. "Keep it," she said without smiling. "I have an extra copy." The coolness in her voice made DJ even more upset. He managed to thank her. Grandpa seemed to have made up his mind to talk, so he began telling the lay preacher about his struggles with anger and beating up his old rocking chair with his Irish shillelagh. Mrs. Stagg called for Kathy to come help serve refreshments. As the girl turned away, she whispered to DJ, "Ormley told me how you and Alfred had twice trespassed on private property." "It's not posted." Ormley said his uncle hired Mr. Folgomby and him, Ormley, as caretakers for that stand of trees, and you two keep crawling over the fence. DJ started to protest again, but Kathy turned with a whirl and vanished into the kitchen. DJ felt miserable, but he politely turned to Brother Paul. "Practically everybody has to wrestle with anger and wanting vengeance," the big preacher said in his deep voice. "It can destroy a person's testimony if they don't deal with it, because it's a spiritual problem." DJ blinked. He hadn't thought of his own strong feelings as a spiritual battle, but it had been harder for him to pray and read his Bible lately. Not that this had anything to do with his resentment and wanting to get even with the Craters, DJ told himself quickly. Have you ever told yourself something just to convince yourself? Mrs. Stagg and Kathy entered with 2 trays of coffee, soft drinks, and cookies. Brother Paul summarized quickly. "So you see, Mr. Dillon, these kinds of feelings have to be considered spiritually. Pray about them. Ask God's forgiveness and accept it. Because people who don't learn to do this sometimes end up mean and bitter." DJ thought of old man Mr. Crater and wondered if that had anything to do with him and his nephew's sour reputation. But DJ didn't say anything because Brother Paul was asking the blessing before the refreshments were served. As the preacher prayed, DJ's mind was racing. He realized if Alfred were to have that ghost dog, something would have to be done fast, because several other hunters wanted that dog too. And if DJ were to write a prize-winning story, the mystery of the polluted lake would have to be solved. That meant he needed to do something drastic right away. When the blessing was over and all the adults murmured amen, DJ leaned over and whispered to Alfred, "We've got to go to the lake at night." Alfred's eyes opened wide, and he stopped chewing on a chocolate chip cookie. Then he slowly nodded. Late the next afternoon, the boys got permission to camp out at the public grounds at Sudden Lake. They took their sleeping bags and camping equipment on backpacks and followed the public hiking trails so they didn't go near the barbed wire fence. The 10-space camping area was deserted when the boys arrived. They had not taken either of the Milfords' hounds. The feet of Blackie the stray were still sore, though they were healing pretty well. Alfred had rubbed salve into Blackie's pads and chained the black and tan to the collar Mr. Milford had made. Tag, Alfred's little brother, wouldn't let them take Duger. Only Hero, DJ's scruffy little hair-pulling bear dog, was with them. The boys pitched their small tent near the water's edge. A couple of fishermen with a small trailer camper drove in about a half hour later and set up next to them. DJ smelled coffee when the men opened a can. He was surprised a little later when he heard the fishermen cuss in the coffee. DJ remembered the clipping Kathy had given him the day before. He left Alfred sitting by the campfire and walked over to the men. "Excuse me," the boy said, coming slowly into the light of their hissing, pressurized lantern. "Did I hear you say that coffee smelled terrible?" "Does it?" the taller camper exclaimed. "Here, smell it for yourself." DJ bent his head over the coffee pot, jerked his head back. "Phew, that's awful." "Sure is," the shorter man agreed, dumping his cup onto the ground. Did you make that coffee with water from the lake?" "Why, yes," the taller man answered, throwing the coffee pot's contents to the shadows beyond the lantern. "It's boiled, and boiled water should be safe to drink, shouldn't it?" DJ said uncertainly, "Have you read this piece from the local newspaper?" "We're just traveling through," the shorter man replied. DJ handed Kathy's clipping to the men. They took it and moved closer to the lantern. They read it in silence, then looked at the boy. "Look, kid." DJ Dillon. "DJ, according to this newspaper story, this woman environmentalist says that this chemical, Penta, DJ said. "Whatever," the taller man continued. "She says that if it's in the water, the smell is released when the water is boiled. A distinct odor, she says. And this coffee sure does smell like that." The other camper said, "In this interview, she also says that a heavy concentrate of the chemical would cause the fish to die fairly easily. But most people probably wouldn't even notice the chemical when it was diluted, and only a few out of 100 might get sick or even collapse." "As I remember the article," DJ said, "this environmental lady said the high concentration could cause acute poisoning, weakness, and breathing problems, including convulsions and collapse. But since you didn't drink any of the coffee, you should be okay." The short man tapped the article with his forefinger. "It says this stuff is used as a fungicide and a contact herbicide." So fungicide is to kill fungus, mold, and that type of stuff. And an herbicide is to kill plants. It is also widely used in the wood preservation. When in dilution and heated, decomposition emits highly toxic fumes of chlorides, which is what happens to the coffee, I guess. Wonder if that smells like Clorox bleach. Ugh. His partner explained, "Do you suppose the fish around here?" He let his voice trail off. He grabbed the hissing lantern and led the way to the lake's edge. His partner, DJ, and Alfred followed. They stood at the water's edge as the taller men held the lantern up high. "There, dead fish," the tall man exclaimed. "See?" DJ recognized rainbow trouts and German brown trout, lots of panfish like crappie, and perch, plus a couple of catfish and some trash fish like carp. Their white underbellies made a strange sight as they bobbed in the quiet water. DJ guessed they were newly dead, or they would have been able to smell them. The shorter man exclaimed, "This lake is poisoned. Come on, Harry, let's get out of here." You kids better go too. We'll report this to the sheriff's office on our way through Stony Ridge." A little while later, the men were gone. The boys and Hero were alone at the campground. The boys stared at the campfire while Hero rested with his scroungy muzzle on DJ's foot. DJ said slowly, "The newspaper story says that how did they say that word? Penta, that chemical, is shipped in fiber drums as powder or crystals. Lumber mills buy it sometimes in carloads because they use so much of it. It's used on telephone poles and pilings, sometimes to preserve wood in children's playgrounds." Alfred looked away from the fire. "I read that too. I know, I was just reviewing things in my mind, and I figure that either that stuff is seeping into the lake from a long way off, like the mill, or what?" Alfred prompted after a moment. "Or maybe somebody dumped that chemical right around here, and it hasn't had time to dilute that much yet. The paper says it dissolves fast in water and would be broken down pretty fast. So if someone did dump that chemical right around here instead of it seeping from a long way off, then it might have been done this afternoon. Or even early tonight before we got here. Those two men set up camp after we did." Alfred turned slowly, the firelight reflecting off his thick glasses. "You saying somebody did it? May still be around and watching?" "I don't think so. All they had to do was dump that chemical and take off. No need to stick around. So I'm wondering if maybe we should go exploring with our flashlights and see if we can find any clues." "Clues? Maybe tracks or something." Alfred stood up and brushed off the seat of his pants. "Yeah, clues. We could do that. Too bad Hero can't trail people." The boys carefully doused and stirred the campfire until it was dead. Doused would be, pouring water on it. They decided quickly on what they'd need to take and what could be left in camp. A bright moon, a few days of past full, slowly rose across the small arm of the lake to the east. The sky glowered above the mountains thick with stately conifers, evergreen trees. When the first moonbeams hit the lake, a path of silver magically appeared. The shimmering ripples looked like millions of silver dollars floating on the surface. Oh, that'd be beautiful. "You ready?" DJ asked, picking up his plastic 2-cell flashlight. "Ready," Alfred replied, checking his 3-cell silver-colored flashlight. DJ started to reach for Hero's leash, but the dog's head jerked up so suddenly the boy knew Hero wasn't reacting to the leash. The dog stood quickly and cocked his head to listen. DJ heard it. A lone hound baying on a hot trail. The dog's voice was like silver bells on a frosty night, clear, clean, and beautiful. Instantly, DJ got goosebumps. Alfred had frozen where he stood. His voice was high with excitement. "It's the ghost dog! Hear him?" "Yes, Oh, look!" DJ grabbed his friend's arm and pointed across the lake. "There, just coming across the face of the moon to the left. I see him! Oh, DJ, look at him run! Come on, let's go catch him!" And that is the end of chapter 8. Wow. I wonder if they will get to really catch him. I have to go around the lake first. Well, that's where we're going to stop for tonight. I hope you enjoyed the story. And I want to remind you, I love you. I really do. But even more importantly than that, God loves you, and He always will. So, right now, for me, it's Friday night, so I want to wish you a happy Sabbath. I'm so glad God gave us this special day for rest. So, have a good one, and remember, whatever you do, keep dreaming. Good night.